the boy Blackbeard Mirage. I'm back. Much love, much love, much love. Major salute. Major what's happening. You know what I'm saying? Major what's good to all the beautiful people in the Midnight Mirage universe, all the ladies and gentlemen. You know what I'm saying? What's happening? We back. And it's the boy Blackbeard. Y'all already know what time it is. The boy Mars himself. I'm in this thing. You know, we in here. Live from Atlantis. Before I go deeper, once again, I got to just show my gratitude. Just show, that I'm very, very thankful for all y'all people. All the wonderful people out there, you know what I'm saying, that's really showing me a lot of love and support. Even a lot of you all that don't comment that often, you know what I'm saying, some of you all show up every now and then, really just to, give me a major salute, and I'm very, very thankful for that. That's very, very, very good spiritual energy. As you all know, that Blackbeard is a very, very spiritual man. And the only one that I actually have fear for is the Most High. That's facts, you know what I'm saying? So, while I'm here on earth, I'm trying to do my best I can to be in the image of the Most High, because that is what we are supposed to be doing. If you read in Genesis, when the Elohim manifested the physical body of Adam, they said, let us create man in our image. So that is what I try to uphold. I got to be in the image of a divine spiritual man. Do I have to be perfect? No. Does that mean Blackbeard is going to keep cussing? Of course it does. Does that mean Blackbeard is going to keep ripping folks' head off if they get in his comment section? Oh, of course it does. But nevertheless, I do know why I'm here, and I won't let my ego or erroneous anger have me going out of whack and out of control. Okay. So we want to keep this thing real, real spiritual, because that's what connects us all. It's the Aboriginal American history. It is our flesh and our appearance by us being copper colored melanated people on this soil. And it is the fact that we all come from these same ancestral bloodlines. All right. So, although I'm gonna have to go to war with y'all sometimes, but sometimes I'm not going to really want to. But that's just to put things in check. What we're going to do in this tape is we're going to talk about basically some things dealing with Aboriginal Americans, because I was thinking about how they like to do the gentrification, and how in a lot of these areas around the city, especially here in Atlantis and across the country, you're seeing a lot of gentrification. Now, what this is when you have basically, the state or whoever it may be, some investors, private investors, they basically want to expand in a certain particular part of town, but this part of town may be inhabited by Aboriginal people or so-called black people. And what they do is slowly but surely they come in, they kind of destabilize the businesses. They pollute the public school system and stuff like that. They pollute the education and basically get the area to somewhat run down. And then next thing you know, they see all the Aboriginal people being kicked out of these, neighborhoods, okay, and kicked out of these particular zones, these particular areas of town. And then shortly after that, what you will start seeing is that same rundown area will start to be built up. You're going to start seeing a lot of high rises, a lot of very, very expensive lofts, etc. It's going on all around here in the city in the A. And like I said, it's going on in other places in the country too. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the history of gentrification here in the United States, or here in America in particular, and how the Americans have always been gentrified by the United States. As I've said before, that there is a difference between the United States and America, okay? America is actually the land, and Americans are the Aboriginal people from the land, okay? So when I talk about so-called black people or African Americans, these are Americans, all right? And they are actually the only people by Americans by blood. Some other people may be Americans because they moved here, and they may have been naturalized or whatever the case may be. But as far as being an American by birthright and inheritance, that's only one group of people on this planet, okay? And that is the people who have always been in the West prior to the United States. When I talk about the United States, I'm talking about the corporate jurisdiction and basically the corporate designation that has stolen a lot of the American land from the American people. And they have carved up their own little, we can say, territories within the American soil. So that is what you all see when you look at the so-called United States map, and they have the 48 to 51 states carved out of the entire American soil. All right. So the United States is actually on top of America, and America is actually buried underneath the United States. All right. So just keep that in mind, because I don't consider myself a United States citizen. I will consider myself an American national or an American citizen. I am that because I'm an American, but I'm not from the United States. OK. So what we're going to do right now is read into some gentrification history. We're going to read into the Indigenous Peoples Act, or the Articles of the Indigenous People, or also known as the Rights of the Indigenous People. We're going to look into that a little bit. And, as usual, just kind of analyze some stuff, just basically get an understanding of this whole gentrification and what the whole point of it is. It's like you're going to always know the Aboriginal people because they're always on the move and they always have some type of corporate society coming in to try to take over their land, to try to get them to, get rid of their natural ways, to get them to disconnect from the spiritual ties that they have to their own land, and basically get them to adopt foreign cultures and foreign identities. So you will know the Aboriginal people because they will always have somebody coming in to do this to them. Just like if you read in the Old Testament, have you noticed in the Old Testament that the so-called Hebrew people always had a other nation that was coming to bother them, it seemed like. And it also seemed like those Hebrew people always were on the move as well. First they are in captivity of so-called Babylon, so-called Egypt, and all these different people coming to bother them, and their hometown always being destroyed and messed up and them having to do a lot of moving around. Also think about how Martin Luther King said in one of his latter speeches that the so-called Negro or African American is actually a so-called prisoner on their own land. Okay, so we got to look deeper into a lot of these little messages that have been thrown out here. But you will know the Aboriginal people because they will be a victim of gentrification, and they will always be a victim of the Neo Trail of Tears. Okay, now what do I mean by Trail of Tears? Well, for anybody out there that has a $20 bill, you will know what I mean by Trail of Tears. Hold on real quick. Let me get something. All right. So we talk about Trail of Tears. We're talking about this guy right here by the name of so-called Andrew Jackson. All right. Now, this bastard right here is very, very critical to Aboriginal American history. And if you are a so-called Aboriginal American, you should be very, very familiar with who this man is right here, because he is responsible and he is one of the early people who caused your areas to be gentrified, in particular here in the southern parts of America. OK, so if you are a so-called black person or a Negro, no matter really where you live in America, more than likely a lot of your ancestors come from somewhere in the South. But the reason we have migrated a lot is because of the Trail of Tears and also because of the American Civil War as well. And a lot of that you can actually give credit to this guy right here. So when we read about the Trail of Tears and Andrew Jackson, this is the guy we're talking about. He's on your $20 bills. And I'm about to show you right now why the United States upholds this guy's image. All right. This is the book I'm reading out of. It's called America, A Narrative History, the 7th edition, Volume 1. Okay, America, A Narrative History. This is the book I'm reading out of. Also, I want to salute the Aboriginal sister right here. Y'all see her. She in the motherfucking house. You know what I'm saying? The goddess of this shit. The real Aboriginal woman in her natural state, natural skin, natural hair, and all that. You know what I'm saying? This the woman we fucking with right here. But anyway, let me straighten her shit up. But anyway, let me get into this shit. Once again, we're reading about this bastard, Andrew Jackson. Jackson's Indian policy. Mind you, when they talk about blacks, Negroes, African Americans, colors, Indians, once again, we know who these people are. Listen up. During the 1820s and 1830s, the United States was fast becoming a multicultural nation of peoples from many countries. Most whites, however, were openly racist in their treatment of blacks and Indians. Mind you, they saying blacks and Indians, but these are the same people now. As economic growth reinforced the institution of slavery and accelerated westward expansion, policymakers struggled to preserve white racial homogeneity and Quote, next to the case of the black race within our bosom, declared former President James Madison, that of the red race on our borders is the problem most baffling to the policy of our country. So the first thing we have right here is saying that in the early 1820s and 1830s, that the corporate United States was fastly becoming a multicultural nation of peoples from many countries. Now, what do they mean by this? Like I told y'all before, the Aboriginal Americans are the people who were here prior to the arrival of Europeans. And although we all may have looked a little different, may have had some different hair textures, etc., but nevertheless, we were all Aboriginal people. May have had even some different languages and some different cultures based on the tribe we come from. But nevertheless, we were all the original American people. But from, like I said, the Yakub experiments, from the amalgamation, and from the human bouquet situation, what you had is that when these different European Caucasians started coming to the American soil, everybody started mixing up with each other. Okay, so the Tower of Babel situation started being inflamed a little bit more. What do I mean by Tower of Babel? A Tower of Babel situation is when you have people who used to identify with each other, but because of a particular disruption in their society, now they are confused and they no longer know how to identify with each other. So there's a confusion of tongues, confusion of ideologies, and a confusion of basically how they socialize with each other. So anytime you have a group of a lot of people who really don't identify with each other based on physical appearance, language, etc., you kind of, are stirring up a situation that can cause mad confusion. So the United States is one of those situations. Like I told you on the previous tape, most people don't even know who the original Americans are. Okay. So that just goes to show you, what I'm talking about. Then it goes on to say that most whites were openly racist towards the Aboriginals, which is something we already know about. So this brings you into the whole segregation, and it brings you into the Knights of the Cross or the Ku Klux Klan or the Knights of Columbus. This brings you into the sexual apartheid of the Aboriginal men and the Caucasian woman as well. What these people started to realize is hey, look, if we're going to have our United States corporation survive, and if we are going to basically, become the new world leaders, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to make sure we at least genetically survive. So we're going to have to somewhat distance ourselves and segregate ourselves from all these colored people around us that look so different. And that is what they mean by, the fear of the United States becoming a multicultural nation very, very fast. Because when we talk about ancient Greece or the ancient Mediterranean, when we talk about ancient so-called Egypt, and when we talk about ancient so-called Rome, these were some of the early civilizations that had this same problem. Basically this multinational type of society to where, everything gets real mixed up and muddied up. And the people who actually started the civilization and started the survival, the empire, they're so amalgamated to where you can't tell who is who. So the same way that America is, the way you don't know who the Aboriginal Americans are, that's how it was in ancient Egypt. It was a time where you couldn't even tell who the original Egyptians are. And that's another little sneak peek I'm going to kind of lead y'all into. I actually know an Egyptian brother in real life. You know what I'm saying? I know a brother from Egypt in real life, and he's going to do some tapes with me. This brother knows multiple languages, and he's actually an original indigenous Egyptian. But he is an Egyptian of the so-called Far East, that what you all know of as Northeast Africa. Okay. So, I'm going to have this brother on the tape, just so you all can actually hear from a real Egyptian and even see how the brother looks, because, we're not actually descended of the Egyptians in the so-called Sudan. So I hope some of you all didn't think that, because when you hear me talk about Egypt now, I'm talking about America. I'm not necessarily talking about over there in Africa. But nevertheless, we're going to have a guest on in the future who is a brother from Egypt who knows multiple languages and actually is darker than I am. He's a whole lot darker than I am. So we're going to have a real Egyptian visiting the Midnight Mirage real soon, all right? So let's keep it up. Andrew Jackson, however, saw nothing baffling about Indian policy. His attitude towards Indians was the typical Western one. Native Americans were barbarians and better off out of the way. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama in 1814, General Jackson's federal troops had massacred nearly 900 Creeks. Let me repeat. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama in 1814, General Andrew Jackson's federal troops had massacred nearly 900 Creeks. So this guy, Andrew Jackson, that's on the front of you all's $20 bill in 1814 in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, this guy right here was known and responsible for slaughtering 900 Aboriginals that were in the South. So if you are from Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, more than likely your ancestors were in this shit one way or another. Let's keep this shit popping. Jackson and most United States citizens on the frontier despised and feared Indians, and vice versa. Jackson believed that, quote, just humane liberal policy towards Indians dictated moving all of them onto the plains of the west of the Mississippi River to the great American desert, which white settlers would never covet, since it was believed to be fit mainly for horned toads and rattlesnakes. So before we go deeper, this guy Andrew Jackson had an Indian policy where he, quote, wanted to get all barbarians out of the way. And he was responsible in 1814 in Alabama for slaughtering 900 Aboriginal Creeks in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Then he goes on to say that we should just move all Aboriginals in the South west of the Mississippi River. Okay, So that's your first thing you got to remember, that these are the policies of this guy right here, Andrew Jackson, okay? The Indian removal. In response to a request by Jackson, Congress in 1830 approved the Indian Removal Act. So the Indian Removal Act is 1830. It authorized the president to give Indians federal land west of the Mississippi River in exchange for the land they occupied in the East and the South. By 1835, Jackson was able to announce that the policy had been carried out or was in the process of completion for all but a handful of Indians. Some 46,000 people were relocated at government expense. The policy was effected with remarkable speed, but even that was too slow for state authorities in the South and Southwest. Unlike the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region, where the flow of white settlement had constantly pushed the Indians westward before, in the old Southwest settlement moved across Kentucky and Tennessee and down the Mississippi, surrounding the Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles, and Cherokees. These tribes had over the years taken on many of the features of white society. The Cherokees had even such products of white civilization as a constitution, a written language, and Aboriginal slaves. So let's break this down real quick. So the first thing is they're saying that the Andrew Jackson appealed to Congress in 1830 to approve the Indian Removal Act, which is one of the early gentrifications. So when I say that, when I say the Indian Removal Act, in your mind, just think gentrification. Just think about them moving a bunch of niggas about the hood and trying to take the area so they can build up a Starbucks and all this other bullshit and bring a bunch of fucking white people in to live. The gentrification has always been going on to you all people. It's nothing new. Next thing, it says that a lot of the tribes in the South, quote, started to take on many of the features of white society. So this is what I mean by the amalgamation. You had a lot of Aboriginals, once again, they started to mix in and marry with these European Caucasians. They started to dress like these European Caucasians. They started to want to speak like these European Caucasians. And they started to worship Christianity like these European Caucasians. And they even anglicized a lot of their names like these European Caucasians. So you got to always remember that you're going to have that split between the Aboriginals who wanted to keep their inheritance and keep their own national identity. And you had Aboriginals that wanted to sell out and team up with these foreign Europeans. And it was always split between the two like that. So it was never a time period where all Aboriginals was on the team of let's battle for our land, nor like it was a time where all Aboriginals was just selling each other out. It was always a split between the two. Let's continue. Most of the northern tribes were too weak to resist the offers of commissioners who, if necessary, used bribery and alcohol to woo the chiefs. Let me repeat. Most of the northern tribes were too weak to resist the offers of commissioners who, if necessary, used bribery and alcohol to woo the chiefs. So didn't I tell you all in the previous tape how a lot of these European Caucasians used alcohol and stuff like that to woo the chiefs? So that's how they got a lot of things done. They would find out who the chief of the Aboriginals was, whoever was the emperor. They would go and try to get on his good side. You know what I'm saying? Giving him what they call fire water, which really is nothing but alcohol, and basically get him drunk and stuff like that. And then next thing you know, the land is being taken over and signed over and stuff like that because he's been manipulated and compromised. Okay. And that's what you had a lot going on. You know what I'm saying? A lot of shit like that. Continuing. On the whole, there was remarkably little resistance. In Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, an armed clash erupted in 1832 and came to be known as the Black Hawk War. Under Chief Black Hawk and Sioux and Fox sought to reoccupy some land they had accompanied in the previous year. Facing famine and hostile Sioux west of the Mississippi, they were simply seeking a place to raise a crop of corn. The Illinois militia mobilized to expel them, chased them into the Wisconsin Territory, and massacred women and children as they tried to escape across the Mississippi. The Black Hawk War came to be remembered, however, less because of the atrocities inflicted on the Indians than because the participants were two native Kentuckians later pitted against each other. Lieutenant Jefferson Davis of the regular army and Captain Abraham Lincoln of the Illinois Volunteers. So this is very, very big. So let's go through this from the top to the bottom. So first they said that they used a lot of bribery and alcohol to woo the chiefs out of their land. Then it goes on to say that in Illinois and the Wisconsin territories in 1832, there was a conflict known as the Black Hawk Wars under Chief Black Hawk, the Saukes and Fox. Now, didn't I read about them in a previous take when I talked about the Chief Black Hawk, and he was basically the Heru archetype or the Christ anointed one? Okay, so now we know about why in Chicago they have a team called the so-called Black Hawks. Now that makes sense, don't it? Don't we have in Chicago, they have a sports team, and the logo of the sports team is an Aboriginal Native, so-called Native American that looks just like we do, with copper colored, that looks just like the Washington Redskins logo. So now you know why that's in Chicago. Now also we know why Noble Drew Ali had a real big movement in Chicago and the whole Midwest. So the Midwest is popping when it comes to this shit. So salute to all the brothers and sisters that's living and from the Midwest. Then it goes on to say that there was a real big battle. So we have another battle. So first battle we have is the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, which is in 1814, which was by General Jackson's federal troops massacring the Creek Aboriginals in Alabama. Then we have another battle, which is known as the Black Hawk Wars, which was led by Chief Black Hawk in 1832 in the areas of Illinois and Wisconsin. Okay. And then it goes on to say that Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln were actually a part of this bullshit. So Abraham Lincoln was an Illinois volunteer and Jefferson Davis was, in the regular army. Okay, he was a lieutenant. So that's very, very interesting because a few years later, Jefferson Davis was the so-called president of the Confederacy in the South. And Abraham Lincoln was the so-called president of the Union. But look at how they was on the same team right here fighting against the Aboriginals in the Black Hawk Wars. All right. Let's keep going. In the South, two nations, the Cherokees and the Seminoles, put up a stubborn resistance to the federal removement policy. The Seminoles of Florida fought a protracted guerrilla war in the Everglades from 1835 to 1842. But their resistance was waned after 1837 when their leader, Osceola, was seized by treachery under a flag of truce, imprisoned, and left to die at Fort Moultrie near Charleston Harbor. After 1842, only a few hundred Seminoles remained, hiding out in the swamps. Most of the rest had been banished to the west. So now you all know about why they were real hard on the so-called black people in the South, because we actually were the only ones in this entire nation that really put up some of the most cutthroat battles. You know what I'm saying? And it was a whole lot more of us down here too, you know. So that's why when you think of so-called black people from the South, y'all kind of look at us a little different. And we're perceived as different. I've noticed that. Like, I've noticed black people from the North, black people from like the West. It's like they kind of view black people from the South a little bit different. It's like y'all think that we may be a little more country, or I don't know, whatever it may be. But the point is that the reason why shit was so much harder on us down here in the South, around the areas like, once again, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Oklahoma, the Carolinas, that whole little region, is because of the resistance and the fight that we put up. All right. So just to let you all know, that's why Atlantis, or so-called Atlanta, is viewed as the black capital. It's no coincidence, people. All right. Let's listen and keep up. The Trail of Tears. The Cherokees had, by the end of the 8th century, fallen back into the mountains of northern Georgia and western North Carolina, onto land guaranteed to them in 1791 by treaty with the United States. But when Georgia ceded its western lands in 1802, it did so on the ambiguous condition that the United States extinguished all Indian titles within the state, as early as the same can be obtained on reasonable terms. In 1827, the Cherokees, relying on their treaty rights, adopted a constitution in which they declared pointedly that they were not subject to any other state or nation. In 1828, Georgia responded by declaring that after June 1st, 1830, the authority of state law would extend over the Cherokees living within the boundaries of the state. So what we have right here is that during the early aspects of the Trail of Tears, basically going back to around 1791, the Cherokee Aborigines in Georgia and in North Carolina actually had, somewhat retreated back to land that was somewhat guaranteed to them. But you had a lot of people reneging on these land deals and stuff like that. So let me show you all a map real quick of how shit looked back then. So here we have a map, kind of showing you, the directions of the Trail of Tears. But as you can see, really, a lot of the red arrows are pointing to the west. Okay, so in the south, you had, of course, the Seminoles. In Georgia, you had the Cherokees. And in North Carolina, you had the Cherokees. In Georgia and in Alabama, you had the Creek Aborigines. In Mississippi, you had the Chickasaw and the Choctaws. Okay, so these are just a little quick little map, just so y'all can have something to look at real quick. So moving on, the discovery of gold in 1829 whetted the whites' appetite for Cherokee land and brought bands of rough prospectors into the country. The Cherokees sought relief in the Supreme Court, but in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, John Marshall ruled that the court lacked jurisdiction because the Cherokee were a domestic dependent nation rather than a foreign state in meaning of the Constitution. Marshall added, however, that the Cherokees had an unquestionable right to their lands until title should be extinguished by voluntary secession to the United States. So here we have right here something that I always find funny is that, the United States is really like, I can't wait till they whole shit just falls because, these people are like, want to come to other folks' stuff and try to tell them what to do with their stuff. That's like, when I think about the United States, that's really like what makes a lot of sense. Like telling people that, oh, you got to pay taxes, telling people, oh, you got to do this, oh, you got to do that. Like, that's just when I think about the United States, that's what comes to my mind, like a regime or like this corporate army that comes in and wants to tell you what to do with your stuff. And then if you don't do it, you get penalized. That's just what I think about. You're penalized either with money or you're penalized with basically being imprisoned. But it's like a real corporate slave type of society. Like, just comes to my mind, man, when I think about the United States. But anyway, by 1838, some 17,000 Cherokees had departed westward on the Trail of Tears, following other tribes on an 800-mile journey marked by the cruelty and neglect of soldiers and private contractors and sworn and pilferage by whites along the way. So during the Trail of Tears, what they don't tell you is that a lot of these Aboriginals who were traveling, a lot of them died from starvation. And then they don't also tell you that they had a lot of them moving during the time in the winter. So it was very, very cold when these Aboriginals were moving. Then they also don't tell you that a lot of these folks were actually following these people and still trying to kill them off as they're leaving the lands. All right. So how you think about, let's think about some of them old, them little old movies like Selma and stuff. And they show you like Alabama in like 1940 or some shit. And they'll show you some so-called black person, trying to go to school. And you see all these so-called white people outside with signs and stuff saying nigger, get out of town and all this type of stuff, throwing stuff at them and all this kind of stuff. That behavior has been around since the Trail of Tears. And that's what they was doing to us then even, as we're leaving town and being kicked out of town and stuff like that. People throwing food at you and all this type of stuff. So when you all hear about the exodus of the Hebrews in the Old Testament, believe it or not, that has a lot to do with this. The exodus of the Hebrews is no different than the gentrification of black people out of the so-called inner city. It's no different. It's no different. All right. So that's just some real quick history on the Trail of Tears. Some real quick history on the Trail of Tears. So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to read to you all some stuff coming from the articles of the Declaration of Indigenous People. I'll read to you all what it is, and then we will go through it, okay? The article Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The member states of the Organization of American States, herein the states recognizing that the rights of indigenous peoples are both essential and of historic significance to the present and future of the Americas. The important presence in the Americas of indigenous peoples and their immense contribution to development, plurality, and cultural diversity, and reiterating our commitment to their economic and social well-being, as well as the obligation to respect their rights and cultural identity. Let me pause right here real quick. So what I'm about to do right now is kind of read to you some of the rights and some of the things that we should be really already doing. And a lot of people say that, well, what does this nationality stuff have to do with all this, etc. Well, what I'm reading to you is ultimately what it has to do with. But let me tell you this before I go into it, before I have an ignorant ass person come in the comment section and then I got to rip somebody in the shreds again. I know that this European Caucasian man really doesn't care nothing about no nationality, doesn't care about, Trail of Tears, doesn't really care about any of that stuff, okay? And I am a firm believer that until we go back into some kind of Black Hawk Wars or some type of Civil War, Everglades, type stuff, until we go back into that mode, me personally, I don't think they really going to respect nothing that we saying. I don't really think that we're going to be able to get them to even budge and move in Congress like that, to be real. So although that these are the rights of the indigenous peoples, until we declare who we are as a nation, and until enough of us do it, and until we come together and we show that we're serious about this stuff, everything I'm reading will never be able to partake in this. All right. So I just wanted to keep that in mind because I'm reading you how things should be, but this is not how things are. And until we get our act together, stuff will never be like this. Okay. So I'm about to read to you some of the rights of indigenous people. Article 1. The American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples applies to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So the first thing is that this article or this whole document applies to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So if I just said who the Aboriginal Americans are, that means that this document applies to these people, not foreign people. Okay? Keep that in mind. Self-identification as indigenous people will be a fundamental criterion for determining to whom this declaration applies. The states shall respect the right to seek to such self-identification as indigenous, individually or collectively, in keeping with the practices and institutions of each indigenous people. So this right here also says is that the self-identification as indigenous people will be the fundamental criterion to see who this declaration applies to. And at the end of the day, it also says that the state shall respect the rights to such self-identification, whether individually or collectively. Now, I'm gonna tell you the problem when you do it individually. When you do it individually, it's that one you versus a whole version of them in the courts, And that's why I said before, like with the Jay-Z verse, we don't believe you. You need more people. It's like, yeah, I can go. Yeah, I can go in there and say that, I'm an Aboriginal American. You know what I'm saying? And that, I am a national of the